of the Spark of Hudson. And for those of you not familiar with the Spark of Hudson, it is a hub for learning and community development. We say that it's where creativity thrives, where civil discourse is encouraged, and curiosity valued. And we're especially excited and proud of our flagship program, which is HudsonUP, and that's the center of the program today. And Hudson Up is a collaboration between the Spark of Hudson Foundation and Humanity Forward Foundation. And it's actually the first small city US pilot for universal basic income. And I think it's the longest running pilot. We just started though, just a few months ago, and you'll hear all about that in a second. But I first wanted to thank the community of Hudson that has been so supportive for some welcoming the Spark of Hudson to the community. We've met some amazing people. We're new to the community and have truly been welcome and embraced, and it's really much appreciated. And particularly want to give a shout out to Mayor Kamal Johnson, who has been a big cheerleader of the work that we've been doing, particularly the Hudson Up program. And with that, I wanted to also thank Joan Hunt, who's here today. Joan Hunt has been an amazing, first of all, cheerleader and advocate for this program. She is the executive director of the Greater Hudson Promise Neighborhood, and also the pilot director of the Hudson Up program. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joan, who can introduce Leah. Go ahead, Joan.
Thanks so much, Susan. And just before I start, I just want to acknowledge Susan and her partner, Albert, who have just been an amazing source of inspiration and generosity to the community of Hudson, particularly coming in at such a trying time, everywhere, but we really feel it here, of course, locally in the Hudson community. So just super grateful for all of your support in making this program possible. So I would like to introduce our PI, Principal Investigator Leah Hamilton, Dr. Leah Hamilton. Leah Hamilton is MSW and PhD at Associate Professor of Social Work at Appalachian State University, and also a Senior Fellow at the Jane Family Institute. She teaches social welfare policy and conducts research related to UBI and, of course, family financial stability and basic income. Her book was recently released titled Welfare Doesn't Work, The Promises of Basic Income for a Failed American Safety Net. And it was just released in February of 2020. Her work has been featured in The Atlantic, Vice News, the National Public Radio, Governing Magazine, the Pacific Standard, and many other news sources. She's also currently on the board of the ACLU of North Carolina, the Basic Income Earth Network, and Influencing Social Policy. You can also find her on Twitter at Hamilton Leah. And we are just so thrilled to have her as a researcher. She has come in with such grace and expertise in this area and really built great relationships very early on with our participants. So I would like to now turn it over to Dr. Leah Hamilton.
Thanks so much, Joan and Susan. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, make sure okay. Know what I'm doing. All right.
And I think I'd like to say that if you have anybody has questions while Leah is speaking, maybe you could either put them in the chat, or if you're on YouTube and Facebook, we're going to be monitoring those as well. And then we can get to the comments at the end of the presentation.
Great, thanks so much. So everyone can see my slide. We're good. All right. Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Leah Hamilton. Feel free to call me Leah. So when I first spoke to Spark of Hudson about doing this presentation, we wanted sort of a status update at the beginning of the Hudson Up project, but we also thought it might be valuable to spend a little bit of time on what is basic income, why basic income Joan did a great presentation with Spark a few months ago about why Hudson Up, but we're not sure if we've spent a lot of time on why basic income. So just in case you're not familiar, I'm going to just give a brief overview of what basic income is and some of the arguments for it. So the Basic Income Earth Network defines basic income as a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirements. So a lot of the pilots that you'll see, proposals you see, don't necessarily fit this definition exactly, right? So none of our pilots are universally delivered to all citizens. And it's not, in our pilot, for example, it goes to one individual, but it doesn't go to all individuals in a household. But some of the most important elements in pilots and in basic income proposals is that there are no requirements that go along with it. There's no strings attached, and there are no restrictions on how the money is spent. The spirit of basic income is that people get to choose how they want to use the money. And a lot of the pilots do use needs tests. For example, ours does, because we want to make sure that, these pilots are not only contributing to the knowledge base on UBI, but also helping our neighbors and citizens who need it most. So why basic income? For me, this question, because I'm a social worker and I've spent a decade researching the existing social safety net, for me, the strongest argument is broken American social safety net. So, for example, eligibility criteria in American public assistance programs like TANF, which is Temporary Assistance Needy Families, which is our most common cash welfare program, SNAP, also called food stamps, are counterproductive to long-term success among low-income families and violate, in my opinion, the human dignity of applicants. So a good example of this is asset limits. I've spent quite a lot of time researching asset limits in TANF and SNAP, and these are limits on participant assets to be eligible for the program. Those were set at about $1,000 in the 1980s and have gone up in some states, even eliminated in a handful of states, but are still as low as $1,000 in some states. And arguably, these disincentivize people from building assets, and which is extremely problematic when 40% of Americans don't have enough money to get through the next financial emergency in their life, a car breaking down, getting laid off, a medical bill. And I also think that these things are ironic because middle-class families in the US are incentivized to build wealth through tax-deferred retirement accounts, mortgage interest deductions. And the operative assumption in those policies is that self-interested actions among the middle class are beneficial to society as a whole, right? So when people buy homes, build their savings accounts and their retirement accounts with the support of the federal government, that's benefiting society as a whole. But meanwhile, when low-income families access government resources that are helpful to them, the narrative is that they're seen as dependent and a drain on society. So I think these two tiers of American welfare are really problematic, even though, but FYI, in case you didn't know, we spend way more on those programs that benefit middle and upper income households. And we're not even getting into corporate welfare today. There's also a body of research called the cliff effect. And this is when income limits disincentivize work, because in a lot of cases, documented cases, people will make just a tiny bit more income, that's, get a 10-cent raise or take on a few more hours at work. And because that just nudges them over the income limits, they lose TANF, SNAP, child care assistance, and they're much worse off than they were before. And some politicians like to paint this disincentive as a negative, why would you work if you could just stay on and stay on welfare and get the money instead of working? But I see it as a choice any of us would make. Of course, we all want to advance ourselves, take advancement opportunities at work, take on more hours at work. But if it means that the ability to send your child to quality childcare tomorrow, feed your children tonight, I think it's a choice most of us would make. So we also have a lot of intrusive eligibility criteria like family caps, which if you have another child while you're receiving assistance, you don't get assistance for that child. Drug testing is being pushed in a lot of states. There's paternity establishment rules in some states, where if you don't identify the biological father of your children, you can be denied assistance. So a lot of these policies that don't apply to middle and upper income households. I don't get a drug test when I deduct my mortgage interest on my annual taxes. Those are only applied to people in poverty, which is another reason I really feel like the safety net violates their human dignity. So when we look at whether or not our current welfare system actually alleviates poverty, so hypothetically, it's there to alleviate poverty. And I think this chart is really helpful in helping us think through whether or not that's the case. So the bottom line, the yellow and orange line, is the number of people receiving welfare, and the top line is the number of families with children in poverty. And the dotted line in the middle is 1996, and I won't go into too many details about 1996, but there were some major changes in welfare policy at that time that put in new work requirements, 5-year lifetime limits, much stricter limits on other things, on eligibility criteria. And the philosophy in 1996 that made that change was that people were becoming dependent on welfare, and that if we push people towards work, we could more successfully remediate poverty. And while this chart doesn't tell us everything, it does tell us that's not the case, right? Pushing people off of assistance and into the workforce does not work. And especially if you'll notice this big bump, you can't see my fingers, but I'm pointing to this sort of hump around 2012, around the recession. That theory especially doesn't work when we're in an economic crisis, and arguably we're in one now that this bump will go back up again. So what we know is pushing people off of welfare assistance before they're ready doesn't work to remediate poverty, and it also doesn't create a sufficient safety net when our country goes through economic swings. So some of the advantages of a basic income among basic income advocates, obviously it provides just an income floor for everyone, which arguably we should be doing in the wealthiest country in the world. It creates it allows single parents, people returning to school, people with disabilities, or other people who work part-time for various reasons are still able to maintain a basic quality of life. There's, in our competitive capitalist system, you usually need 2 income earners for a basic standard of living. And there's a lot of households that are left out of that and fall through the cracks of that expectation. UBI is also superior because it has lower administrative costs in our current safety net programs. If it's going out to everybody, that takes a lot less paperwork, and it doesn't take an army of caseworkers across the country checking people's paperwork, checking people's eligibility. So it's a more efficient use of funds. Let's see. So this is a more of a controversial advantage that it allows us as a country to become more competitive globally. But when people talk about the minimum wage, increasing the minimum wage, corporations might say, well, because we're in global market competition, we just can't afford to pay people $15 an hour. And I have no intention of opening a minimum wage debate here, and I don't want to pit UBI versus minimum wage. But it arguably, until we can fix our minimum wage, creates an income floor while allowing corporations to become internationally competitive. It also allows for innovation. It allows artists, small business owners, scientists to create to innovate, to create new things without being stuck in a dead-end job, without fearing for their financial security. So some frequently asked questions about basic income. Would people stop working? Lots of data says that there's little to no effect on employment in pilots since the 1960s. The most recent Stockton results actually found an increase in employment. Would it create inflation? Most basic income proposals are at minimal dollar amounts per person, and lots of research has found that would have little to no effect on inflation. Is it too expensive? Some models find it would be cheaper than our current social safety net for some of the same efficiency reasons, We've already talked about, would the poor be worse off? This is a question that I think is really important. If hypothetically we replaced a lot of our safety net programs with the UBI, which is not necessarily what most people are proposing, but if we did go in that direction, I think that's an important question. So while a family who was receiving assistance from every possible public program, say TANF, SNAP, housing vouchers, women, infants and children, heating assistance through LIHEAP, emergency food assistance, Medicaid, every public assistance program you can think of would be hypothetically worse off than most basic income proposals. 95% of families who receive public benefit programs participate in 3 or less of those programs, and the average monthly total benefit for everyone receiving public assistance is $404 per person. So I think that arguably people would not be worse off. And of course, it's really important to note that I've seen very few no solid basic income proposals that include replacing Medicaid. I think it's pretty clear that there's no way a basic income could replace healthcare, especially in catastrophic instances. So there have been a lot of basic income pilots over the last 60 years. They started in the 1960s, lost a little momentum, and then have picked up again in the last 10 years. And there's really consistent data across all of these pilots. We see little to no effects on employment rates. We see improved nutrition, school attendance grades, test scores, and educational attainment improve for children of recipients, improved physical and mental health, less drug and alcohol abuse, decreased fertility, increased birth weights, decreased criminal behavior, more positive parent-child interactions. And in one saturation site experiment, where that means that everybody in a geographic area was eligible, there was even community-wide decreased injury and hospitalization rates, which is pretty amazing. So these things are well established, and at least in the basic income space, not really up for debate at this point. So why HudsonUP, and why are we doing more research when we also already know all these answers? So first, in case everyone's not familiar, HudsonUP is a 5-year basic income pilot with 25 randomly selected Hudson residents. The participants receive $500 a month with no strings attached, including participating in the research. Quite a few, about 10 participants have said, no, thank you, I don't want to participate in the research, and we've absolutely respected that. And so because the effects of basic income are well known, and I don't think it takes a lot of, it's not brain science to say unconditional cash improves people's lives. So why continue doing research on it? And in this pilot, it's a small sample, so we are going primarily with the qualitative research trajectory, because while we know that what basic income affects, we know less about the how and the why. And I think those are important questions that qualitative research can answer. So for this pilot, we're going to be asking things like, what are the effects and the interactions between basic income to recipients' health, income, assets, family relationships, well-being, employment, and future orientation? And I think this last one is especially interesting question. So what happens to people's future planning when suddenly they have agency over cash assistance, when traditional assistance has so many limitations and people don't have agency? I'm gonna take a quick drink of water before I jump in. So far in the research, I've done interviews with 15 of the participants. And my goal in this wave one is mostly just to get to know the participants. We have the luxury in this pilot of 5 years. So I'll be building relationships over the next 5 years with these participants and trying to really get to observe and talk to them about how it changes the trajectory of their lives or not. So my first question, I was looking at what were their finances like before the pilot, and most people, a very common theme that arose with the people I spoke to is that most people either did not have enough to live on before the pilot or were just barely surviving. Now, that's not a terribly shocking fact because there were income limits to be in the pool to be selected. a lot of people, it also, another theme that arose is people were hit hard by the pandemic financially. So for example, one person said, I had gotten hit with the pandemic, so I was out of work at like 5 months pregnant. Some participants were surviving before the pilot with the help of family and friends. Before the pilot, health conditions had a significant effect on some participant finances, and this is of course true. A lot of times we see people in poverty research who are doing fine and then get hit with medical emergencies or chronic health conditions that can wipe them out financially. Finances cause significant stress in participants and their relationships. So, for example, one person said it was rough for a while, just frustration. There were some heated discussions with my spouse on trying to figure out who can do what and where. There was strain there. Another person said, I'm either needy towards my friends because of finances. That person meant or they would hurt relationships, or just not be able to do things that normal people can do, or not seeing in a normal way. It was always survival. And I think those things really are backed up by a lot of the research on financial strain. Financial strain can cause difficulty in relationships. There's a lot of research between financial strain and increased child abuse and domestic violence, because financial strain just hits everybody hard, obviously. So my next question was, what were people's goals, financial goals, before HudsonUP started? So I wanted to see if their financial goals change or stay the same after they participated in the pilot. So some of the themes that arose from this question: before the pilot, some participants were so focused on survival that they really didn't have long-term financial goals. For example, one person said, I really didn't have any financial goals because I'm so far in debt and I don't know where to begin, how to fix that and fix my credit score. Another person said, honestly, I didn't have any long-term goals because I was basically living day to day, once a month, waiting for public assistance or food stamps or whatever. And there's no way, if you're on public assistance, to save anything. Another theme that arose is that before the pilot, some participants wanted to return to work, but they were hampered by public assistance or public policy rules. So for example, one person said, I was hoping that I would be able to get some form of assistance that I can maybe go and get a job, but I need to be able to pay daycare to take care of my child. It would basically be for me working to do that. And that's a pretty common theme we see in a lot of research of low-income people, that because we don't have really affordable quality childcare in the US, and childcare assistance waiting lists can be so long that sometimes for a person at a low-income job, it's essentially a zero-sum game. Some participants talked about wanting to finish higher education before the pilot. Some participants wanted to build assets like homeownership or small business development. For example, one person said, I always wanted to be a homeowner. And another person said, I always wanted to start a business cooking. And then I asked people, what was different now, or what was the same now that they were on the pilot. And some of the themes that arose there was the pilot was helping participants cover basic day-to-day needs. So one person said, I can pay bills and have things in my apartment. Through the pilot now, I don't have to worry about paying rent or asking my family to help me with paying rent. For a lot of people talked about the pilot decreasing financial stress. So for example, one person said, you just aren't worried, it's going to be there, it's fine. I think that's the relief of anxiety is way more valuable than people realize. I think this is a really important quote, because there's a lot of research on financial strain and the psychology of scarcity, and how when you're constantly under psychological stress of financial strain, that it affects everything in your life. It affects your ability to make decisions. It affects your ability to form relationships. It changes your ability to plan for the future and your executive functioning skills. Some people said that the pilot helped them pursue their goals even faster. So for those people that had, long-term goals before the pilot, they saw this as a way to get there faster. For example, one person said that the pilot helped me move towards my goals, and I can save money now and start moving towards my classes now that I have extra money and I know it's going to be there every month. Another theme that arose about the pilot was that for other people, it had allowed them to start thinking about new goals, which was really interesting. So one person said, I do feel like now I have on the pilot the ability to look for another job that has longevity because I'm not as scared anymore. The pilot helped, another person said it, the pilot helped me get my new place after separating from a toxic relationship after many years. I thought that was really powerful, that because this person was financially independent now, they were able to escape an abusive situation. And we see that a lot in intimate partner violence research, that that financial dependence can be a risk factor for a lot of people, especially women. The pilot has opened my eyes to look at the possibility of maybe putting aside some money to invest in a house for my child and I. So this person had never really thought that they could pursue home ownership, but now they were. The pilot definitely helped me consider going on and opening my business. So this was a person who was really had kind of dreamed of having a business, but now they actually thought it might be possible. And then another person who had been hampered by public assistance rules said on the pilot, I can start work. And other people talked about the pilot helping them build savings. So, for example, I've kind of set it aside. I've kind of acted like I haven't received it. And because, as I said, I'm saving it for grad school, but it's nice to be encouraged that I have a backup. So that person not only saw that the pilot was going to help them save up for school, but also sort of this psychological benefit of having savings for emergencies. Another person said, if it wasn't for this, I would just be totally living day by day and still borrowing. So this has really been helpful that I can actually put a little bit of money aside. And then a final or one more, I have one of two more final themes that I thought was really interesting, was that some participants talked about thinking beyond the 5 years of the pilot. So things like, how can I use this money now to set myself up for financial independence in 5 years? So whether it's investing it or starting a small business. So I thought that was really positive that people were thinking beyond 5 years. And the final theme that I really want to talk about is when I asked participants if there was anything else they'd like to tell me at the end of the interview, almost universally, participants expressed how extremely grateful they were for the program. So, for example, one person said, I'm really thankful for the pilot program and it really did help us. The pilot's a big help. It's a big help for me. And it was kind of a little relief. I'm like, well, God do love me. I really appreciate the HudsonUP plan. It really helped out a lot. And it was like a blessing, really. That's what it is. I'm very, very grateful, very appreciative of the person giving this opportunity to me and my child to be able to be in a better financial position. And finally, I like adding this quote at the end because it's a call to action for all of us. I would like to encourage HudsonUP to continue because it does help disadvantaged persons like myself. So I'm going to stop there and I'll take this off screen share in just a second so we can all see each other. But what I'd love to hear is your questions, your comments, but also I'd love to hear, because we have the luxury of 5 years and this research evolving over the process, what are some of the things that you would like to learn from this pilot? What are some of the unanswered questions you see in the UBI space?
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Leah. That's super interesting, and really appreciate all the work you put into it. Before we move to questions, and by the way, if anybody's got questions, if they could put them, or comments of what you'd like to learn, if you could kindly put them either in the chat here, or if you're watching live streaming from YouTube or Facebook, if you could put comments, questions there, that would be great. But I guess first, something that I learned, and maybe you or Joni could comment on, is the privacy factor here and how that all plays into the research and what you're finding. Because I noticed you didn't use any names.
Joan, do you want to talk about that, or should I?
You can start and then I.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, we prioritize confidentiality in this project as that's our first goal, first, middle, and last goal. And that's obviously true in all research that that people should be assured confidentiality, but it's especially true in a small town. And I work closely with Joan because I don't live in Hudson. I do live in a small town. I get it. Everybody knows everybody. But having Joan on the ground, being a Hudson resident, knowing the stories and knowing, like, I sent her all of my quotes that I was going to use, and I thought they were totally scrubbed, totally anonymous. And she was like, oh, I know the backstory of this particular one, and it might be out there. So we're working together to protect the confidentiality of these participants, because one, they have obviously the same right to privacy and dignity as the rest of us, and also not to influence the UBI process, the pilot process. Go ahead, Joan. I'll let you add on to that.
Sure. So we will and are in the process of developing a storytelling cohort for our pilot. So we will have a couple of participants that have been through extensive media training and kind of understanding the risks and benefits to going public in this space. So actually, Susan, I don't know if you plan to talk about this, but I could give a plug for it now. Tomorrow on PBS at 5:30 our time, on our local PBS affiliate, there will be a story on HudsonUP, and one of our participants will be highlighted there, and talking about her early experience with the pilot. So we will be, of course, furthering the storytelling cohort and having additional participants come forward as they are willing, but it's very much on a volunteer basis and includes a lot of media training and sort of really understanding the broader context for going public. So.
Great, thanks. And just to continue on that show tomorrow, it's the PBS Weekend News Hour segment at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The local PBS affiliate for those of us in around Hudson is WMHT. Yeah, so that's very exciting and a good tease for who will be the participant coming forward. We have a question here. Tristan, do you want to, speaking about the role of philanthropy and philanthropists in the pilots, presumably scaling up would entail a transition to state or federal government, literally perhaps buy-in?
And I'm sorry, do you mean this pilot or pilots across the country?
You're muted, Tristan.
I'm sorry. While I was fussing with my earbuds, I didn't hear Leah's response to that.
Can you, when you said, I noticed you said pilots plural, so are you thinking
Right.
about like all of the pilots going on across the country? And
Well, I thought that I could be mistaken, but I thought that the Stockton pilot, I thought that there was philanthropic involvement in that in that pilot program, and that's really the only one I'm familiar with.
Yeah, and that's true of this pilot. That's true of a lot of the pilots that are going on. There's some donors that are launching most of these pilots. So you're right. It would be a financial transition if we saw this as a public program. I mean, full disclosure, there's lots of different funding models out there. Some of them are, let's fund it through cryptocurrency. Other people are saying, let's fund it through solar farm co-ops. There's a lot of different funding models out there. But the most likely is a more of a federal or state funded policy. And where you were going with that is, what's the buy-in for federal funding?
Well, I think it might. I think it might entail. I'm self-conscious speaking on camera, so excuse me, but I think it would entail or involve persuasion of, say, local and state and federal elected officials who are very concerned with taxpayers. And,
absolutely, yeah.
So whereas, I think the U.S. is kind of unique in the role that it gives to philanthropy and philanthropists in actually shaping public policy. But I think that one way that has broad public support is because these are private individuals doing what they want with their money.
Yeah.
So so transitioning or scaling up would involve a different set of questions involving taxpayers.
I agree with you. So, full disclosure, I'm the PI on this project, but personally, I think the biggest questions left to answer about UBI are public policy ones. How do we make this palatable to taxpayers and voters and people supposedly representing those taxpayers and voters? I do think the UBI space is sort of buzzing right now because of the pandemic and because of some of the unconditional stimulus payments that have been going out and people seeing what happens, when they have unconditional payments. I think, this child tax credit that's going to start in July is unprecedented and sort of, what us policy nerds call a policy window, because this is really the time to put those proposals forward now. And and I know that everyone at HudsonUP is working really hard to make our voices in this space heard, because we all know that this is the window, this is the time to demonstrate that, when during, especially at all times, but especially during economic dips and national global emergencies, we have to have a strong safety net, and our current one is not cutting it.
There's also a national initiative, I'm not sure if you've heard, called Mayors for Guaranteed Income. And there are cities across the country that are getting really creative around how they're funding their local UBI pilots. So I was on a call yesterday with 146 other people from across the nation who are in guaranteed income communities of practice. And so just to give you a sense of like how, to Leah's point, like it's really, really buzzing nationally now, and people are getting really creative about how to fund pilots.
Yeah. There's also an interesting initiative going on in Germany where they're trying to get a referendum going on in individual states, whereby to use public money to fund pilots, UBI pilots. So it's sort of an interest, by people voting in a referendum, it's an interesting way to kind of get buy-in on a pilot basis. I'm not saying it needs to be rolled out statewide, but I think that might be an interesting way to move it here as well. I have a question about sort of, the interesting thing about you, Leah, and you, Joan, is that, very few of us know who the participants are. And just curious, like, from what I understand, it's an incredibly diverse array of people who are receiving the UBI, and yet you're seeing consistent themes. Maybe you could talk a little bit about who just generally speaking, who are the people? Maybe you could describe them a little bit in terms of the diversity.
Yeah, I mean, we have a great array of participants. I mean, when I first talked to Joan about coming on as the PI, she said we've got all the categories covered and all of that you could think of, but we've got families with children, we've got retired persons, we've got racial diversity, I think diversity of gender and gender expression. So I think that's really key. And I'll say one more thing and toss it to Joan, because she's met the participants. But we just keep finding this over and over again. There's no secret that unconditional cash improves people's lives wherever you are in life. Go ahead, Joan.
Sure. So Leah mentioned in her opening remarks that it was a lottery. It was a random lottery, but it was random, but it was weighted. So we used a weighted system using the Opportunity Atlas data. And so we were looking at sort of inequities in our community, specifically using that tool. And we weighted the lottery based on those inequities that are, pretty universal, but we did look locally at what those were. So for example, women of color had the highest chance of being selected in our lottery, and that is really how our sample worked out. So we have 50% people of color in our cohort. And as to Leah's point, we also have, different gender identities. We have, like she mentioned too, people of all ages, college students to, folks that are retired, and everything in between. So yeah, the sample really is very representative of the community here in Hudson, and the weighted lottery system really worked out beautifully. And we are hoping other communities adopt a similar model.
Sorry, what is the weighted system? How does that work?
So we used an algorithm, and I am not a data or a statistician by any means, but the system looked at using the Opportunity Atlas data set and took the current individuals that entered our lottery and weighted the system in that way. Susan or Leah, I don't know if you speak more detail to that, but that's what I.
Yeah, I think there were 3 factors in terms of what the Opportunity Atlas looked like. One was gender, another was race, and the other, I believe, is income level. And what the algorithm did is that, and it looked at children and their opportunity for success over their lifetime. So those folks who had a lower chance of success in their lifetime were actually then, according to our algorithm, had a higher chance of receiving lottery tickets. And that's how we ended up with, as Joni said, folks who say were, Black women living below the poverty line had a higher chance of receiving or becoming participants in the pilot. So I have another question about, so in Stockton, I understand from what you said, Leah, that there was it 12% of folks who actually, a 12% increase in participants got full-time work, I guess. And I was noticing in some of the comments that you posted that people were potentially like looking for work, had an opportunity to work. Maybe you could comment a little bit on, I was just curious about that statistic and how that related to the people that you met.
Yeah, and I don't remember the exact numbers in Stockton. I'll have to look it up, but I thought it was something like 40% of people were working more or something. But what I can tell you is that there has been in other pilots research about why this has happened, and there's a couple of different possible explanations. One is being freed from limits on public assistance limits, right? So they don't have income limits, so they can go out and get jobs and without fear of losing this assistance. So and that's been demonstrated in a few pilots. And also I talked to people who were in the Ontario basic income pilot. And I talked to one really interesting person who had a mental health diagnosis, and he also received disability payments through the Ontario Disability Support Program, which is really similar to our disability program in the US. And he said something really interesting. He said that he doesn't know when he wakes up if he's going to have a good day or a good month, good day or a bad day, a good week or a bad week, a good month or a bad month. So his mental health condition was really, there's no way for him to tell if he was going to be able to keep his job. So his job security was kind of up and down, but he loved working. But because of that inconsistent employment, it really put his disability payments at risk. So he just couldn't, because if he started a job, get cut off a disability. But what if he has a bad mental health day the next week, and then he loses his job and he, has to go back and reapply for disability and go through the whole thing. So for him, it just wasn't worth it to lose that consistent funding, that consistent income. So he just didn't work, even though he really wanted to work. So that's one example of a person who's sort of bound by public assistance rules, that they couldn't work. The other, especially in developing countries, some of the data points to the fact that that UBI can help people put together, launch small businesses. And especially this is true, in the US, but especially in developing countries where people just need to be able to, buy a food cart or something like that, and unconditional cash can help them do that. There's a couple of people in our pilot, like I mentioned, that are interested in launching small businesses, like, doing a food truck during the summer, during the Hudson tourist season. Another person wanted to start an auto detailing business in their garage. So just small things that would help them work more without being and this would facilitate that in different ways. Oh, you're muted, Susan.
Susan.
Sorry. I know that there's a control group, or is that right? And what's going on with them?
Yeah,
And maybe talk a little
thank
bit
you.
about that.
Yeah, so for people, the folks that were entered the lottery and were not selected, there was another group that 50 that was randomly selected to be a control group. And we are in the process of reaching out to those 50 and seeing who would like to participate. So what I didn't mention here is that I'm doing a qualitative interviews, but also collecting some quantitative surveys, valid and reliable scales of on health and well-being and family interaction. And so we're going to invite a control group to also fill out those surveys and see if there's differences in the participants' trajectory and the control group. We say all those things carefully because a treatment group of 25 isn't going to lend us a lot of statistical credibility. But one of the reasons we're doing that is because lots of the MGI pilots, Mayors for Guaranteed Income pilots, are coordinating to collect those same research instruments. And the hope is to be able to sort of create a meta-analysis of that data so we can see what's happening in lots of pilot sites across the country.
Yeah, there's a question. Tristan, do you want to ask it, or should I ask it?
Yes, I was just wondering if you think that new interest in publicity for UBI coincides with the threat of automation and AI to middle-class jobs.
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of discourse in the UBI space about how much AI will take over jobs in the next 50 years. And you find people on very different ends of that spectrum. There's been a lot of different sort of forecasts that they'll replace anywhere from 1% to 50% of all American jobs. And it's just so hard to know for sure. I think most UBI advocates say, we don't know for sure, but there's a lot of other reasons that to support a UBI. I think the tech industry is especially, full disclosure, I think the tech industry has been very interested in UBI because they see that the future trajectory of AI. And I'm kind of sit in the, yes, it may change the future of work for us. But there's a lot of other important reasons. I do think one thing we need to think about, I think it's, who knows if 50% of the American workforce will be out of work in 20 years. But what we do know is that every time technology changes, every time industry changes, you get a huge number of people who need to quickly transition to new careers, or people who might be near retirement age, have trouble transitioning. So UBI, I think there's a strong argument that UBI sort of creates a floor for, so the rapid change in technology and progress. Even if people aren't out of a job permanently, we need to sort of allow a basic standard of living while technology just continues to move faster and faster.
Right, that's super exciting. So the pilot itself just launched. Was it October? So there were October, November, December, January, February. I guess it's there are 6 months of 6 payments, right, that have already gone out. And just curious, Leah, from you or from Joni, like over the 6 months, like whether you've noticed a change in people. I noticed, you talked a little bit about that, Leah, but just having met them or talked to them, just would love to have a little more color on that and what you've experienced or heard.
I think a lot in the initial months was around trust building and people actually settling in and believing that this was happening. I think we're getting to a point now where people are like, okay, we're 6 months in, this is consistent, it's happening. I'm not being asked to pay it back. I mean, we had to do a lot of work on the front end around just proving to folks that this was a real initiative. It wasn't a scam. We weren't trying to, get the money back or any, so there was a lot of education and outreach that went into launching the pilot. So now I think we're settling in. The research started at a really great moment in terms of where we were with the participants and having built those early relationships. So now I think we're at the point where we can really dig in there and really capitalize on those interactions with participants. But yeah, I think we're cruising along nicely. Participants are, of course, very engaged, very grateful every month when the payments do happen. But yeah, I think we're sort of just entering in this phase of like, okay, now we're settling in and it's really happening.
And Jody, we didn't get to talk, but you were the ones that you made those initial phone calls. What was that like?
I did. That was a very emotional couple of days. Amazing, really. I knew many of the participants. I've lived in Hudson for, since 2006 on and off, but have been here consistently since 2011. And been doing work as a community organizer. So I knew many of the families and the participants. So those phone calls were absolutely emotional and unbelievable to be a part of, and sharing that with folks. And again, at the same time, a lot of like, this is real, like this is really happening. There was so much disbelief and people saying, I never win anything. I've never won anything in my life. And just having to tell them that this is really happening. And then I, met with everyone one-on-one to go over all of the information and to talk about the benefits and all of the details of the program. So yeah, it was an unbelievable experience, honestly.
It's good that they knew you, because otherwise they really probably would think it was a scam. So that they had
Yeah, for the participants that I didn't know, because there were a few, there was a lot of, and even up to the orientation when I met them in person, still kind of like a hesitancy or a disbelief.
Yeah, amazing. Leah, I know there's a question about how you became interested in DI.
Yeah, I love this question. So I spent a decade researching welfare policy, and I did a lot of stuff on TANF asset limits. That's why I talked about it earlier and I was looking at these little mechanisms, like how do you, improve welfare policy to improve people's lives. And, these little policy levers like asset limits, like income limits, and I finally just sort of over time came to this realization that if you strip those away, if you strip away all those harmful mechanisms in our current social safety net, what you're left with is a UBI. And so I just kind of moved into this UBI space in the last several years because I'm done trying to, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, basically, is the best analogy.
Yeah. And there's a book eventually that's going to come out about this. Is that
Oh,
right?
yeah. So one of the long-term goals is a book. So I'd like to, protecting all confidentiality, I'd like to kind of be able to create a narrative of what happens in people's lives over 5 years. Because I think that's one of, like I said, the biggest unanswered questions are public policy ones, really, and public opinion ones. And I think that being able to, read someone's story, put yourself in their shoes, I think as I hope will be a driver in people really understanding why we need a UBI. I'd love to hear Susan and Joan talk about their interest.
Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I heard about UBI years and years ago, and I originally I was a disbeliever. I didn't really, it was just such an odd thought that people would just be given money, no strings attached. You don't have to work for it. And then I kind of realized that in my own life, weirdly enough, I kind of had my own UBI. I had an aunt who left Berlin, or fled Berlin, and then had accumulated a little wealth. She had a trust fund that gave off just a little bit of money, so not a lot, but it was enough so I didn't have to worry about about putting food on the table or making rent. And it gave me the freedom to be able to travel and to choose the kind of work that I wanted to do. And so in a sense, I kind of got my own UBI, and I recognized to myself what how powerful this was. And so I I think, the idea of trusting people to know that they know best what to do with them, with money, and to give them the freedom to be able to have those choices, I think was a real, what kind of convinced me that how wonderful it would be if everybody could get it. How about you, Joni?
I'm probably the newest to the UBI space here. But so as I mentioned, I've been doing work in Hudson since about 2006, working closely with families, partners in the community, elected officials, everyone that interacts with families here in some way. And a lot of our work is around breaking the intergenerational cycles of poverty in a place-based way. And so of course, time and time again, you run into the fact that people just don't have enough. They don't have enough resources. They're forced to make really tough decisions, for themselves and their families. And at the root of that is really the lack of cash, the lack of income. And so when I learned about this a little over a year ago, actually from Susan, I had heard of UBI, loosely nationally, but I had no idea that, we were sort of on the cusp of this amazing opportunity for Hudson. And so I was initially very intrigued and super excited for how this could directly impact the lives of children and families here in Hudson. So yeah, that's how I came. And I, as a social worker, and I think Leah could speak to this as well, social workers occupy a really interesting space in the UBI world. And I think it connects to our core values and our ethics in the profession, and sort of like this idea of economic justice and the rights to, self-determination for the folks that we work with. There are just many themes there that I think are really core to this work and making it actually happen and realizing it. So that's another way that I feel drawn and connected to this work.
Wonderful. Well, coming up on the hour, I guess just in concluding, Leah, you had mentioned wanting to know from the community what folks wanted to include in the study. You want to talk a little bit about what you'd be looking for, and also who folks should contact if they have ideas?
Sure. I'll drop my email in the chat. But if there's things that we haven't covered that are not well covered in the UBI literature, what are the unanswered questions that you'd like to see from this pilot?
Great. And also maybe, Joni, since you're running the pilot itself, maybe if folks, I guess they could get in touch with you as well. Okay. That's great. Well, I really appreciate, Leah, all the work that you've been doing, and Joni, you running the pilot as well. This is a heavy lift on both ends. So really, really appreciate all you're doing, and just wanted to echo also from the community. Love to see people engaged and involved and excited, and those who want to support the initiatives, we welcome that. So please do get in touch. Joan put Joan at HudsonUP.org for those of you who can't see it, and Hamilton L at appstate.edu. Anyway, I want to thank you again for coming today and all the work you're doing. And please, everyone, hope you stay healthy, and best to everyone. Thank you again.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all. Bye.
Thank you.